Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Speed Chess Championship, which is being held on chess.com. Now, today's match featured a very exciting set of players between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from France, commonly known by the initials MVL, and a man who claims he will become the first American world chess champion, Hans Niemann. Now, as this is a Speed Chess Championship, the players are playing three portions. They play a 5+1 portion, a 3+1 portion, and finally a 1+1 portion. And the player who scores the most points will be crowned the victor in this match. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the action. Now, the first game that we're going to be taking a look at is with Maxime leading Hans by a score of 5-4, or sorry, I should say 4.5 to 3.5. This is game number 9 of the match. And at this point, things were going pretty well for Maxime, and he's playing with the white pieces. So, the game starts with the move e4, Hans plays the move e5, we get knight f3, knight c6, and now we have the move bishop b5, and here Hans decides to play the move a6. Now, later on in the match, Hans would switch it up a little bit. He would actually start playing the Berlin defense with knight f6, but in this game, he decides instead to play a6. We get the move bishop to a4, we have the move knight to f6, castles, and now we get bishop e7. Maxime plays d3 here. This is what is known as the closed Spanish. If white were to play the move rook e1, most probably Hans would have played b5, bishop b3, and castles. And if Maxime plays the move c3, this allows d5 with the classic Marshall Gambit. So, we get d3, Hans plays b5, we get bishop b3, we get d6, now we have a3, an important move for white. White almost always has to push the c or the a pawn here, because if you play a quiet move like h3 to stop black from playing bishop g4, now black has to move knight to a5, attacking this light square bishop on the long diagonal. And even if objectively the position is completely fine, black will be able to trade a knight for a bishop, and in this case, with black having the two b's in the long run, black should have zero problems whatsoever. So, we get the move a3 here. If black were to play knight a5, now white can play the move bishop to a2, retreating the bishop and keeping it alive on this long diagonal. So after the move a3, we get this move castles. Knight c3 is played here by MVL. We get knight to b8 from Hans, trying to reroute this knight to the d7 square. Now, this is very similar to another variation in the Spanish, which is the Breyer, just to show you guys what I mean by that. If white goes rook e1, let's say b5, bishop b3, d6, c3, castles, and h3. Black normally goes knight b8, and after d4, knight bd7, let's just say knight d2, bishop b7. Black has rerouted the knight to d7 here, and he has the bishop on this diagonal. However, in this position, white has created a big white center with these pawns on e4 and d4. So when we compare this to the game here after knight c3, knight b8, white is struggling to push d4 here. You could always play d4, but you don't have a pawn on c3 to recapture. Instead, you have the knight here. So for that reason, it's not quite as good. So we get the move bishop d2. Hans plays c6 here. We get the move knight to e2. Now, c6 is a little bit of a strange move. I'm not super familiar with the theory here behind this move, but nonetheless, based on the quickness with which Hans and Maxime are playing, this is still most likely theory. So we get the move knight to e2, we have the move knight bd7, knight g3, and now we get the move knight c5 here from Hans, trying to attack this b on b3. It also does stop white from putting the knight on f5 immediately, as black can recapture. So we get the move bishop a2, Hans goes bishop e6, we get b4, bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, and now we have the move knight e6, and here a4 is played by MVL. Now, as you'll notice from the time situation, Hans trying very hard to press Maxime on the clock thus far in the game. At the same time, the position is a little bit easier for white to play here, as white can play for queen to a1 and attack on the a file. Additionally, white also has the jump to f5 with the knight in play here. So, after a4, we get the move rook e8, c3 played here by Maxime, a move which I think is played simply to protect the pawn on b4, and maybe also down the road, white can try to play d4 and play in the center as well. Hans goes bishop f8, we get the move queen c2 here. d4 might be an option here, but after d4, I suspect that black can at some point maybe trade and even go d5, e5, knight e4 here. And the position is very chaotic. This pawn on d4 is under attack, the pawn on b4 is a little bit loose as well, and black is this jumbo horse on e4. And even though the computer thinks white is okay, in a blitz game, it's going to be very difficult to play. So instead, we get the move queen c2. Hans plays queen c7. Logical move here. Black wants to play for d5. If you go d5 right away, white can simply eat the pawn on e5. So we get queen c7, preparing to play d5 as the queen guards the pawn, and now we have the move rook f a1. Hans plays queen b7, and now we get the move h3. A quiet move, simply creating a look for the king on h2, so there will be no back rank or ice skater checkmates that exist later on. Hans plays move h6, and now we get the move bishop e3. It is interesting to note here that the queens being on c2 and c7 did allow both players to potentially push d4, d5, but neither player chose to do it. Hans moves the queen away, which stops d5, because now the pawn once again will be hanging. But for Maxime, with his queen on c2, d4 would be a possible move, because the queen is overprotecting this pawn on e4. Instead, we get the move bishop e3, we have knight d7, and now the move knight d2 is played. Again, it feels to me that d4 would have made a lot of sense here, but perhaps Maxime was simply unsure about the position. So he goes knight d2 after 2 seconds. We get the move d5 now, an excellent move from Hans, as his knights are very, very well placed. Black also has a little bit more control over the center at this point, and I would actually prefer to play this position from the black side. So Maxime goes knight b3, we get the move g6 played here, simply stopping knight f5, and now we have the move queen e2, and we get bishop g7. Now both players are maneuvering, and maneuvering. Neither side is trying very hard to open up the position. Nonetheless, sooner or later, one of the players will have to make a critical decision. So we get the move queen f3, and now finally Hans decides to take the pawn on a4. Now at this point, computer actually thinks that after d4, bishop d2 for example, black is a little bit better after takes and this move knight to b6 here, try to pressure the pawn on a4, but also moving a rook to the center of the board and pressuring the pawn on d3. Now, none of this is super straightforward, of course, and it's very understandable from both players' point of view that you don't want to make such a committal decision, because at this point in time, with the players having about 2 minutes each, if you spend a minute and you make a critical decision and it's wrong, you're going to be on your back foot, you're going to be under pressure on the board and the clock as well. So we get the move pawn takes pawn, rook takes played here by Maxime, and now we have the move d4 by Hans. We get bishop d2, and the move c5 is played. Great decision from Hans to play this move c5. You'll notice that right here, he actually is using his time a little bit at this point, and he does go for a critical decision. So we get bishop d2, c5 is played, and now Maxime goes knight to a5. We get queen c7, and we have the move knight e2. Now the reason that Maxime plays knight e2 here is that probably he's very concerned about these pawns on the queen side. If you take the pawn on d4, black can probably take with the knight and create a nice little bastion and try to fork with the knight on d4. If you play a move like c4, which is also possibly a move, black probably will trade and get another bastion with this knight on c5 that permanently will target the pawn on d3. So we get knight to e2 being played by Maxime, and now we have the move knight b6 from Hans. We get the move rook a2. Apparently here, takes and something like rook a b8 would have been better for black, but again, this is computer chess. So we get the move knight b6, we have rook a2, and now we get this move c4 from Hans, really creating a lot of chaos in the center of the board here, and it's anybody's guess as to what the result will be. So we get rook c1, and now we have pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, and now we get the move takes, and we have the move rook d8, and queen b1. At this point, a lot has happened. The center has exploded. There no longer are pawns on the c or d file. There's now an open c file for the white rook, while black has a rook on the open d file. So there basically are trade-offs here. Both players control different open files. So we get the move queen d7, and now we have bishop d2 played by MVL. A nice move, intending to go bishop e3, rerouting the bishop and targeting the knight on b6. We get rook c8, we get takes, and now we have the move knight b3 being played, and here Hans goes knight c4. Now, just to point out why this is supposed to be a little bit better for white here, apparently white's supposed to go bishop e1, and after rook c8, there's something like rook d2 here, and white tries to contest both the open files here. Again, not something very human, and not something that I really would expect anybody to play. So we get this, rook c8 takes, knight b3, knight c4, and now we have the move knight c3 being played by MVL, intending to jump with the horse to the d5 square. We get knight d4 from Hans, MVL goes knight d5, and now we get the move knight takes bishop. Now the big problem for Hans, and this is one of the general points about blitz chess in general, is that when you get very far behind on the clock, if your opponent has obvious moves, i.e. in this position after knight c3, jumping to the center right away, or recapturing the bishop on d2, whereas with black, you have to make decisions. You've got a weak pawn on a6. Do you trade the knight for the bishop? When you are down on clock, it's very, very critical, because if you don't have easy moves, you tend to make mistakes. Now, in a classical game, the reason I compare this to when I say blitz game, is if this were a classical game, this would be completely fine for black. Black would have no problems whatsoever, but with limited time and no obvious moves or ideas, the advantage shifts the other way. The pendulum swings to where it is easier here for Maxime to play. So we get knight d4, knight d5, we get takes. Now we have queen d6. Important move, of course. If you were to play knight takes knight here, white would simply play queen takes knight, and with this golden horse here on the bastion of the knight on d5, white is simply quite a bit better. So we got the move queen d6, we get queen a2, we get king h7, and now knight c5 played by MVL, and these knights in the middle of the board are suddenly very active, and with 30 seconds versus 9, it's looking very probable that Maxime is going to win the game. So we get rook c6, we have the move rook to d1, h5 is played, knight e3, we get queen f6, queen d5, not rook d6. He plays knight e2 here, check, which is a very, very important move. Queen d5 is a serious blunder, by the way, here, because in this position after queen d5, probably what Maxime thought was rook d6 here and queen c4, where the queen and knight target the pawn on a6, and white is doing fine. But Hans, with 5 seconds on the clock, spots this move knight e2. Now, throughout the match, one thing that Hans did do very well, I wasn't actually watching all the match, but the little bit that I did catch, is he was finding very, very good moves with limited time on the clock. So even though he was down on time in a lot of games, he was finding the best moves when he was down to like 5, 6, 7 seconds, which shows that he does have very good nerves at times. So we get knight e2, king f1, knight c3. Suddenly the black knight is forking the queen and the rook. We get queen d3, takes, and it's looking like Hans should win the game. He's got a rook for a knight, and other than time, he's very much in control. So we get rook d6, knight d5, queen h4 is played. Now we get queen f3, f5 played here. We have the move king g1. If white were to take this pawn, expecting takes and queen f5, after which white would be okay. Unfortunately for MVL, there's this move queen c4, checking the king, and then winning the knight on the d5 square. So we get the move king g1, we get queen g5, now we have g3, we get h4, g4, takes, bishop f6, and now we get the move king g2. Knight b7 here would draw the game, apparently, because after rook to e6, knight c5, and back and forth, it's a draw. And if black goes rook c6 here, I believe white has the move knight to d8, attacking the rook. If you take right away, I can simply start checking you forever, and the game will end by repetition. Or if you play the move rook to c1 here, after the move king to, I believe, h2, once again, the bishop is under attack. If you go king g7, these knights fork, and if you go bishop g7, which maybe is also a move, I think after knight e6, these knights are super, super active. They're jumping right towards the black king, and there's simply no way to win the game. So black probably would have to take, and after check, the game would end in a draw. Instead, MVL goes king g2, we get king g7, king h3, with the move bishop e7, queen c3, bishop f6, queen f3, queen c1, and now we get the move knight d7 from MVL. A very strong move using these knights to pressure the bishop on f6. Hans goes bishop g5, we get knight takes pawn, and now we have the move rook f6, which is an epic fail in the position which hangs the rook on the square. Now, what MVL has done very well is, even though he's been losing for the last 10 plus moves, is he's kept the game going. He's kept it where even though he's losing, Hans does not have an easy way to trade pieces or force a win. And finally, with 1 second on the clock, Hans cracks with the move rook f6. We get takes, with the move knight d3, and now we get this move queen c3, and here we have king g2. Hans goes g5, and now we get knight c5, takes, and we have the move bishop e7. Now, after knight takes a6, if we take stock of the position, white has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns, black has 2 pawns, and with white being able to push the pawn up the board, you should win. We get king f6 here from Hans, and now MVL inexplicably plays this move knight c5. If MVL were to push this pawn up the board, he would win the game for sure. If black goes king e5, you have b6, bishop d6, and then b7. The knight guards the square, you push the pawn, and this is a technically winning endgame. And if black goes bishop d8, to stop the pawn from advancing, you can simply go knight to b4. If king e5, there's knight c6 forking the king and the bishop. And if you play a move like king to e6, there are many ways for white to win, but probably the cleanest way is simply to go knight d3, covering the critical squares here, where the king cannot move forward, as the knight and the pawn cover the critical squares, and white will win the game. Instead, we get the move knight c5. Now we have king e5, king g2, king d4. And already here, Maxime has thrown the advantage away. It's still probably slightly better, but the knight can't really move without losing the pawn. You can't push the b pawn forward, and thus black has great chances to draw. So we get knight d7 from MVL, which simply gives away any chance of winning. We get king e4, b5, king to d5. Another great move from Hans here, as if the pawn goes forward, you have king c6 as in the game, and after check, takes, we get knight g6, bishop d6, king h3, king c5, MVL sacks the knight for the pawns. Doesn't really matter what he does here. The game will end in a draw. And eventually we end up with a draw here at the end, where after f6, Hans sacks the bishop for the pawns. If white were to go king h5, by the way, black can simply wait forever with the bishops, so it doesn't make any difference. And after f6, we get takes, king f6, and the game ends in a draw. So this was a very, very exciting game that was played between the players. Now, this game served as the turning point in the match. As I mentioned before, going into this game in the 3+1 portion, Hans was trailing by a score of 4.5 to 3.5. After this draw, the score was 5-4. But at this point, MVL, you can say, tilted a little bit. I think he thought he should have won this game. And Hans got red hot and won the next 4 games in a row to take an 8-5 lead. Now, MVL would rally back, and the match would end up tied in the 1+1 portion, which leads us to our second and final game that we're going to be taking a look at, which is a game played in the 1+1 portion with a score all square at 11.5 each. Winner of this game will advance the next round to face Wesley. So, loser is eliminated. Now, in this final game, Hans is playing with the white pieces, and he opens with the move e4. We get the move c5, knight f3, d6. We get bishop to b5 check being played. Hans avoiding the classic knight off, which would be MVL's favorite system. So, we get the move bishop b5 check. We have bishop d7, takes, castles, rook c8 played here, and now the move d3 from Hans. All pretty standard so far. We get g6, c3, bishop g7, and now the move d4 here. Hans trying to build the classic big white center. Additionally, black is a little bit behind in development here. You have not moved this knight or the rook, and because you have not moved the knight and moved the rook and the king, I should just say castling, white has potential to try and attack in the center of the board. So we get takes, knight f6 played here, and now we get to move knight c3. Already a little bit of a strange choice from MVL to trade the pawns on d4, because if he does play knight f6 right away here, white does not have knight c3 to guard the pawn on e4. So we get trade, knight f6, knight c3 here, knight on c3 guards the pawn, we get castles, queen to e2, and now MVL blunders horribly with this move a6. What MVL needed to do here is play a move like e6, maybe knight to e8, maybe even e5 here, really anything except what he does in the game, because after a6, Hans charges forward with this move e5, attacking the knight in the center of the board, and as you guys can tell from the evaluation bar, black is in serious trouble. So, MVL goes knight to e8, Hans plays e6, we get pawn takes pawn, and now we have the move queen takes pawn, king h8, and this very strong move knight to g5, going for knight to f7 check to fork the king and the queen. We get the move bishop takes d4 from MVL, sort of a desperation moment. There really is no way to avoid losing material here. If you were to move the queen, for example, after check, if you don't sack the rook for the knight, you go king g8, there's check here, queen g8, doing a temporary Botez gambit, but after takes and knight f7, this is the classic smothered checkmate. So, we get the move bishop takes d4, knight f7, takes from MVL, takes, and now we have the move knight e to f6 being played. MVL has a knight and a pawn in return for the rook on a1 here, but if Hans is precise, he should win the game. So we get the move bishop to h6, threatening to checkmate on g7. We get knight to g4, covering the square on g7 with the bishop, while attacking the bishop on h6. We get the move bishop g5, now we have queen to f8, queen takes e7 played, and now we get this inexplicable blunder queen f5. Now after queen to f8 here, if white were to trade the queens first and then play this move bishop takes e7, this is game over. It is finished. White is winning the game because if you move the rook to f7 here, white can go bishop h4, guarding the pawn, and if you play this move bishop takes f2, king h1, let's just say rook f5, white can simply go bishop takes d6, maybe even knight e4 is good enough. Either way here in this position after bishop takes pawn, black simply has one knight for a rook, but we're in an endgame. There are no queens on the board, and white should win this game pretty much every single time. So after queen takes e7, MVL plays move queen f5 after a 7-second thing. Now, MVL did use his time here, so you do have to give him credit for that, but this really does throw it away. If MVL were to play this in-between move, knight takes f2, white is actually not better whatsoever, because if you play a move like queen takes d7, for example here, black is knight to d1, checking the king on g1, and after white goes king to h1, queen takes f1, it's uh-oh spaghetti-o time, as we get a classic ice skater checkmate on f1. So, the way for white, the way that the game probably would have continued is queen takes queen, rook takes queen here, and then probably something like knight to e2, but after this move bishop to a7, let's just say white goes bishop f4, you have check and knight f2 at the very least to make a draw, and maybe you can even play for more with this move g5, attacking the bishop and intending to create some fossils towards the white king on g1. Instead, we get to move queen to f5 from MVL, and now bishop e3 is played by Hans, and the game is effectively over here, as black's threats towards the f2 pawn vanish immediately, and any other threats like a mate on h2 are really, really unlikely, unless you get lucky. So we have the move bishop e5, h3 is played, knight f6 from MVL, and here Hans plays the move bishop h6 again, trying to checkmate on g7. We get the move knight g8, and now we have the move queen g5, another excellent choice here. Queen to h4 maybe is also possible, but after queen h4, there might be some tricks like bishop to f6, creating some complications. So we get queen g5, we have the move queen to f7 being played, now we get queen to d2, knight e7, and now the move bishop g5. After knight to f5, we get the move rook a d1. Not the only move, but it's definitely a good choice to put pressure on the pawn on d6. We get the move h5, and now we have rook fe1, we get king h7, and this move knight d5 is played. Hans has put his rooks on the best files here, the e file, which will eventually open because white can play f4, and also the d file where it pressures the pawn on d6. MVL plays move rook c4, desperately hoping for some counterplay, and now we get the move knight to e3, rook to d4, we get queen to e2, rook to e4, and now we have the move queen f3. MVL is trying not to exchange any pieces, but it's really futile here as white's moves are simply too easy. We get the move knight c5, knight takes knight, we get pawn takes knight, and now we get the move bishop e3. Another good move, not the only move to win, but it's a good move to target the knight on c5. MVL goes knight e6, we get the move bishop to c1, we have knight d4, and now we have the move queen d3. And at this point, Maxime cannot avoid the trade of the rooks on e4, and it's all but over. We get queen g6, f3 is played, and now we have the move rook to h4. Worth pointing out here, if I were playing this game, I probably would just take and go queen to c4, knight f3, and then king to h1 is good. Even queen to f1 is also probably good. I think the main reason that Hans didn't do this is he probably figured he didn't have to potentially let black connect these pawns in the center and or allow knight to f3 check. I probably would have done it because after we get f3 and rook to h4, even though white is winning, there now are some faint glimmers of hope. If Hans makes even one mistake, there's probably going to be a rook h3 or a queen g3 trick and maybe a mate. But Hans plays this move king to f1 here. Maybe not the best move, but it's a good move as it stops rook takes h3. We get the move knight to e6, and now we have this move bishop to e3, intending to bring the bishop back to f2. MVL goes rook a4. We get the move queen to b3, and this is really the point at which there's no return, because now the rook is on the wrong side of the board. Queen is pressuring the pawn on b7, and there are also threats towards the knight on e6. We get rook to a5 being played. I mean, b5 is probably the only move, I should say. But after rook to c1 here, as white's going to start infiltrating on the c file, it is over. We get rook a5, queen takes b7, bishop g7, and now rook takes d6 is played. Maxime's position is simply falling apart. He plays rook takes a2, and now we get to move queen to b3, which allows rook takes b2. Now, this is a very surprising blunder from Hans at this point. Pretty much anything wins, but I do think that Hans probably was feeling very nervous. He knew that he was on the brink of winning this game and the match, and most likely he forgot that after rook takes b2, suddenly you can't take the knight, because then there's queen takes g2 with the classic checkmate and all the threats with the kebab on the second rank. So we get takes, and here we have queen takes rook being played. We get bishop takes queen, and now we have the move bishop to f2. Now, very fortunate for Hans that he has this resource, but it does show again the good nerves to keep calm, even though it felt like he had made a straight up blunder and was close to losing the game. So we get bishop f2, and even though white has sacked the queen for the rook, now white is able to win this knight on e6, and white will have two towers versus a queen and should win this game. Now, you'll notice from the computer evaluation, not a conclusively winning advantage, but in a bullet game here where the rook's moves are much easier than moving with the queen or the pawn, and the very, very weak blacking on h7, it is going to be very hard to play. So we get bishop c3, we get rook d takes e6, queen f7 played here, and now we get to move rook to e7, and MVL simply resigns the game. Now, MVL fell apart very, very quickly here. I suspect that MVL assumed that Hans had made a huge blunder when he allowed rook takes b2, and then he just couldn't recover even though he was still in the game. What the computer would have preferred here is queen to f7 first, and after rook takes e6, threatening rook to e7 here, black can go for this move bishop to a3, covering the e7 square and intending to go bishop b4 to sort of attack these stacked rooks on the e file. Not super easy to play. Even bishop to f6 here to me looks like a possible move here, intending to play a5 and a4. At any rate, it is surprising that MVL simply did not see any of these ideas and just blunders the game right away with this move rook d7. So what does this mean? This means that Hans scores a shocking upset to beat MVL in the SEC. He moves on to the next round where he faces Wesley. So now we only cover a couple of games, but I will give some general thoughts on the match. Now, having looked at a few games here or there, I didn't watch it from start to finish. My general takeaway is that it felt like Maxime did not really have a plan B. When he didn't get the positions he wanted, whether it was in these regular Spanishes or even in the Berlin defense where he lost a couple of games with the white pieces, it didn't feel like he had a plan B. And when he wasn't able to get any momentum going with the white pieces, and then he had some games that he lost in the Berlin defense specifically, he struggled a lot. And that is the one knock that I would say about Maxime over the years. It feels like when he doesn't get what he wants, either in the Berlin defense or in the Italians, he doesn't really have that plan B in the match format specifically, and he struggles in such situations. Now for Hans, maybe he didn't play great at times, but overall he kept his nerves together when he was under pressure in the very critical moments, especially this final game. Sure, he made a blunder with queen b3, but he still was able to recover, sack the queen, and play bishop f2. And the ability to control his nerves in this game, as well as some other games when he was very low on time, paid massive dividends for Hans in this match, because if he had not controlled his nerves, he would have lost by a very big margin. So for Hans, it's obviously a great victory. He moves on to the next round. He faces Wesley. For MVL, it's definitely a big disappointment to lose this match, but he has recently won some of the rapid events on chess.com, so I don't think that he's all that concerned. All right, you guys. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, the recap that I've done of the Speed Chess Championship match being played between Hans Niemann and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back very soon for my regular setup, doing regular recaps and YouTube content in the near future. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this and enjoy the rest of your evening. Have a good one. Bye.